So today is April 9th, 2019, and my name is Chelsea Wen.
My name is Mai Tan.
And we're here interviewing Matt Manilow. So just to start off, can you tell us about where you were born and a little bit about what it was like growing up there?
I was born in Manila, in the Philippines. Growing up for me was sort of, I guess, because my family came from like a middle class family, so we weren't really struggling or anything like that. But it was almost like I was living in between the city and kind of like the suburbs, because I went to school in the city and then I lived in the suburbs, so we were always commuting for long distances every day. I really didn't get a lot of culture shock in terms of like moving here in the U.S. because the Philippines was colonized by the U.S. and so there was a lot of like Western influence already there. So it was a lot more of things that I didn't learn there that kind of like shocked me when I got here. It was simple. I was very happy-go-lucky, I guess, growing up. Yeah, I really just had to worry about going to school and making my parents happy with my grades and all that. It was a lot easier, I believe, growing up with same Filipino friends and being in the same religion, which was being Catholic. So my friends and I always shared like a lot of common things together. We all went to private schools and yeah.
What did you mean by like being shocked by what you didn't learn in the Philippines?
Well, when I got here, I was already 19. So there was a lot of things that a lot of people would probably think that was kind of like easy or like a normal thing. I didn't know how to cook or to even use a rice cooker or, even like the clothes washer or dryer or anything like that. Simply because we had people doing it for us. So it was frustrating for me, kind of like not knowing that or that I wasn't prepared for that. So.
What caused you and your family to like immigrate to America?
Growing up, we never really had a plan. Like, it was never mentioned by my parents that we were like, hey, maybe like in 20 years we're gonna move to the States. My dad was like a VP for an electrical company there. My mom was a teacher, and they've been working for the same company for more than 10 years. It all started with my grandpa being diagnosed with cancer. My parents came here for a vacation and to see him and take care of him. And then, according to my mom, the story goes that my aunt told her that there was like a shortage of teachers here in Houston. So she was like, hey, just maybe just try applying for a position, even if you're just here as a tourist. So she applied, and then they went home, and then we were just living a normal life, whatever, like nothing. And she got a call that she got accepted. So after that knowledge that she got accepted, everything just happened so fast. You know, like so I was told that we were gonna like move like maybe in 2 years or something like that, and in a year I started slacking off in college. Just started partying, whatever. Yeah, because like there wasn't any point in kind of like
Yeah.
doing better, I guess. Yeah, but it was like it happened so fast, and it only hit me when I already came here.
So like when you were growing up in the Philippines, like how did you have any like kind of like preconceptions of what America would be like, or aspirations to go there, or anything like that?
I was scared, just because like I know that, well, because I was already 19 and you know, like I already had my friends there. I was like I was dating somebody. I always thought that the U.S. was almost kind of like perfect place to be. You know, growing up, having like a colonial mentality that the West has always been like the greener pastures and stuff like that. Yeah, that's what I thought America was, like green lawns and you know, everybody was driving their own cars and credit card mentality, basically like consumerism, and you can just get whatever you wanted as long as you worked hard for it. That was like my idea, and to a certain point it's still the same, except like I'm like learning about the history and about like, you know, colonialism and racism and all that, and that's where like the golden blanket has been taken off, and it's just like everything unravels, and yeah, it's not surprising, but it's it's almost like, why am I here kind of thing, you know.
So like, had you not come to, if your mom hadn't applied to the teaching job here, what were your original plans back in the Philippines? Like, what were you trying to do in aspirations?
To be honest, so I graduated in high school. I was 16 when I graduated, so I just, as soon as I graduated, I went to college. And I didn't know what I was going to take, but for the sake of kind of like being on the safe side, like making my parents happy and earning a lot of money, I was like going for computer engineering. So if I didn't leave, I probably would be, you know, like a computer engineer, and I don't know, I probably wouldn't be painting, you know, like what I'm doing right now. Because like in the Philippines, if you're an artist, you know, it's sort of, if you're an artist from a poor family, then you're going to be poor for the rest of your life. But if you're an artist coming from like a wealthy family, then you automatically get like,
I see.
Your network and whatnot. But I mean, it's kind of the same here.
Yeah.
But I can imagine that it would be harder there.
I see.
Yeah.
It's a lot more stratified over there.
Yeah.
I see.
So when did you start learning how to paint or start painting in general?
Well, I don't know. I guess I would say when I was a kid, my parents would always just get us crayons, watercolor, pastels, and I remember my dad, since he worked at an office, he would take home like stacks and stacks of just office paper. The ones that had like holes in the side, because the printers were, you know, like really old school, and that's where we would draw on them, and it kind of worked as like a sketchbook almost. So, and then my parents like included my brother and I, my older brother and I, like in art competitions, and I mean, I never won anything, but it was something I was always interested in, and then, you know, like comic books and cartoons was like a huge influence on me growing up. But it wasn't until 2006 that I really like told myself that this is what I really wanted to do. You know, because like when I got here in 2004, I was going through like a really dark phase, and I didn't have like the right mind to decide on like, hey, like, what do I do? Do I continue computer engineering, or do I take up something new, since I'm, you know, like, hey, new place, new person, here it is, you know. So I listened to my parents, my aunts, you know, who's a nurse, and I was like, okay, let me go into the medical field and try, you know, maybe it's for me. And that didn't work out, and I felt bad because my parents were paying for my college. So I had like a sit-down talk with them, and I told them, Mom, Dad, I can't do this anymore. You know, I don't want to waste your money anymore. Because no matter what I did, you know, like I was staying up late, I was going on to like study groups, Starbucks and whatnot, and I was still failing, and that's when I realized like I'm doing something that I really don't want to do, and I can't imagine myself working at a hospital, you know, till like what, like I'm like 65 maybe. So yeah, I just told my parents like I want to do art, and my mom, who was the one asking a lot of questions, she was scared because I was gonna pursue art. She was like, what are you gonna do after graduating and all that? And I always told her like, hey, I'm gonna teach, and that was kind of like, I don't know, something to assure her, you know, so she won't be scared. But I've never taught any class since I graduated. I mean, I've worked at, you know, galleries, and I worked on museums. You know, there are other jobs for artists out there other than teaching. So, yeah, you know, and now that I'm working for myself, and my mom hasn't really asked anything about it.
How did your parents like first take it when you sat down and told them that you wanted to become an artist?
Well, they were, you know, typical Asian parents, I guess. They were scared because my parents really wanted to be assured that I was gonna not fail. And I just told them like it's something I'm really passionate about. And I always believe that if you're passionate with something, then the chances of failing is lower than something being, you know, if I was a nurse, somebody probably would have died on my care, you know, and that scares me. You know? Like putting somebody's life, like, you know, in your responsibility, and, you know, I don't think I could take that, like, mentally and emotionally, probably.
So they eventually came around to it?
They were constantly questioning. Maybe not until like 5 years ago or something like that. But once they started seeing that I've been showing, I've gotten some collectors, then they kind of like, okay, maybe he's not gonna fit.
He's got some credit.
Maybe, you know. But then it's funny because, you know, I have siblings. You know, my brother works at a bank, my younger brother's a nurse, and my sister's studying to be a doctor, but she's, you know, doing like bio research. So whenever like careers come up, they always say like, oh, it's okay, you can be the only artist in the family. You know, like it's that we only get like one artist in the family.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like, I don't know, demeaning, but then at the same time I'm like, yeah, like I don't want to be competing with my siblings, like having a show here and then, but yeah.
So how did you like start getting your foot into like the art world?
Well, when I started taking classes first, but then I didn't know what to really focus on. So I was taking all of the art classes that they offered. I was taking photography, sculpture, drawing, printmaking, ceramics. So I know like how to do stuff like within like different practices. But then I started leaning towards photography and painting more because it was like for me painting was like a practical thing. I wasn't making a lot of money, but then I was able to like get materials so I can just paint on stuff easier compared to like the sculpture where either you get like you have to buy like a big block of wood or plaster or something like that, which was expensive. And then I was kind of like doing photography on the side, like shooting weddings and all that stuff, but it came to a point where I couldn't afford like catching up with like the latest stuff. So then it narrowed down really to like painting and drawing. And then, so I started making my own paintings and I was still in school. I felt like I didn't need to ask permission, like, because I think there's like a mentality where a lot of people think that you need to graduate first before you go out there or something like that. But I was already kind of like joining like open calls and, getting kind of like my name out there. And then I kind of got involved with graffiti as well.
The Houston graffiti scene?
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. I was like part of a crew and all that.
Wow.
I mean, I didn't dance, break
Wow.
dancing, whatever, but I didn't do that part. But yeah, we were doing that for a while, and then there was at one point where we got pulled over by the cops. So that kind of like opened my eyes. I was like, this is something I don't want to be doing. I don't want to get in trouble for. I mean, it was cool. It was fun. The thrill of it, but for like the career that I wanted to achieve, I felt like it wasn't.
It wasn't worth the trouble.
Yeah, it wasn't worth the trouble. So my goal was always to kind of get out there, show my work, and it still is my goal, to be able to be shown in museums and whatnot. So yeah. Oh, and I started working for art institutions as well. I was like the studio manager for Houston Community College, so I got to meet like a lot of artists through there. They were teaching, and then I got to meet some students who would just hang out there, who were really interested in art. So I became like really close friends with them, and then through my professors, I got like some art advice and whatnot, on top of just being in their classes. And then I started working for this artist as well. I was doing, like designer paintings, I guess, on the side, and getting paid for it. So it kind of like taught me how to like do landscapes or portraits or whatnot. So like when I was at U of H, a lot of my professors were like, "Oh, he can paint already," kind of like. So I was able to get into the program easily.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, I was just constantly showing, constantly going to art shows, you know, trying to support my friends, and then even like supporting my professors, and then, you know, now they come to my shows and whatnot. So now it kind of like went full circle with them.
Before we get into like your more professional work, can you describe more about the Houston graffiti scene?
Yeah, I'm really curious.
Yeah.
I've never heard about
Yeah,
this
I
before.
don't know anything about it, but it sounds really interesting.
Well, I wasn't. It was really interesting, like when I was part of it,
Mhm.
because it was in between the times where it was purely like, just on the walls,
Mhm.
and then when that movie about Banksy came out,
Oh yeah, I remember.
Exit Through the Gift
Yeah,
Shop came out.
yeah.
So that's when graffiti kind of like started
Taking off.
more into mainstream, and then getting more into like galleries.
Mhm.
And then there was like a show in LA that I forgot the title of it, but then a famous curator like Kay, like, let's put graffiti into white spaces,
Yeah.
or like the white cube.
Mhm.
And so a lot of like the graffiti artists that I know in Houston started, you know, showing up in galleries and whatnot.
That's really cool.
And it was weird because there were like purists against, you know,
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
they're like, graffiti should just stay on the
Accessible?
streets,
Yeah.
you know, be accessible to like the masses, which is what it originally is for, compared to like a higher upscale kind of snooty audience. So, yeah, I mean, and then there was also a lot of people who were doing wheat pasting. I mean, it wasn't a huge scene,
I see.
but then it was there. It was like a grounded scene where, like, you know, old school graffiti artists are here in Houston.
Was there like kind of like a message that everyone would kind of like push out, or like, you know, like what kind of demographics would be involved in like the graffiti scene in Houston?
In Houston?
Yeah.
I was mostly surrounded by Hispanic or Latino graffiti artists. But then the goal really was, there wasn't like just a main message. The main message of graffiti was to get your name out there.
Oh yeah.
You know, like who had the biggest tag out
Yeah.
there, or the biggest, you know, throw up, or who was able to like get on top of like a bridge and like put their name on there. So it was about getting known for, you know, so it was more like promoting yourself. There wasn't really like anybody doing kind of like political messages like how
I see.
Banksy was doing them. But then ever since that movie came out, other people like started jumping into, you know, being political activism and all that. But I felt like it was always like an activism as well towards high art. And, you know, like the whole structure of what art should be and what it shouldn't be, and or where it should be shown and whatnot. So I guess that's what it is.
Yeah. I feel like Houston graffiti scene has kind of like expanded a lot in recent years, especially with the murals
Yeah.
and stuff like that. Do you feel like the graffiti scene is connected to that in a certain sense, or?
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of my friends who did graffiti are doing a lot of murals right now. You know, I even went to school with some of them. And I'm all for it because, you know, when you're an artist, you gotta hustle, you gotta, you know, make a living, and that's one of the ways where, especially the people who have like almost perfected their craft with the spray paint.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you get like a huge wall. You could be paid, you know, like 5 figures
Yeah.
or something like that. So yeah, I'm all for everybody, getting their money.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's really cool. But I guess now we can move on to your actual art style. So like, how did you start like solidifying like what your art style is?
Well, I was like, well, it all kind of started when I was a junior at art school. I didn't have money for supplies, and I was like struggling,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a spot at the school where people would just discard materials, and not like a trash bin,
Mm-hmm.
but it was just a spot where people would just like put extra wood or whatnot, and I was always like on the lookout there, just grabbing whatever I think that I could make into, or I could use for painting,
Mm-hmm.
especially that I was majoring in painting, so
Yeah.
that's what I had to do. So I was like painting on canvas that had already paint on them, or it had like some stains on them that people didn't want them, or wood that was like a tabletop or something. And I had like a lot of paper, just from just from being an art student, and I was also being like the studio manager. So I was already kind of collecting materials that some students would just leave when they're done with their semester and all that, and I would take them home. So I was using a lot of different materials, and that was like one of the things that made me stand out from my classmates in the junior block. And then I started dabbling with paint even more. But then I realized that my strength was really into putting things together. Because like when I was growing up, also, I went to like a technical school, so it was like we had like a technical curriculum in academic.
I see.
So we were doing like shop work, metalwork, woodwork. So I was already using a lot of, I use tools with my hands a lot. So I figured it was something that I felt natural with, and something that I really enjoyed doing. So now, as part of my practice, I like put out on social media saying like, hey, if you guys like have things that sort of have a meaning to you, but you don't want trash, then you can just give them to me. So a lot of like my friends have been giving me stuff, so I'm kind of like a hoarder almost. And then like my wife and I love thrifting a lot, so I when I see something that I could use, then I buy it. But then most of the stuff that I get, I also use. It's like different things, like porcupine quills, dried flowers, and I keep them because like I never know like hey,
when you could use it.
when I could use it, which is kind of like a problem. And the whole idea behind that is that having like a sense of community to build something. So in a way, I'm reaching out to people, and then that whole interaction of like giving and sharing, builds the relationship even more. And then when they see that, hey, I gave you that, that fabric or something like that, and they always get excited whenever they see it in the finished painting. and it's also kind of like having people's memories
Mhm.
kind of like immigrate into my own memories. So in a way, it becomes personal to me,
Yeah.
and then it relates to like my whole immigrant story.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's my practice. To sum it up.
So what's like the most like interesting piece that you've incorporated into your art so far?
The most interesting piece that I've incorporated in my art so far, I would say, is because I still keep in touch with my former boss, who was also an artist. One day she just called me and, hey, I have some fabric for you. I was like, oh, okay, cool. Let's go meet up and, let me get them off of your hands. And so she brought them out, and I was like, hey, this looks kind of familiar. So it's a bunch of vintage pineapple fiber textile from the Philippines, but then she's white. So I was like, how did you get this? So the story is, her mom was a nurse, and she was sent off to the Philippines like during the war, and she collected these items, and she felt like I was like the perfect person to give them to. But then it was kind of weird because she was also telling me that she had read some letters from her mother, and it had like a lot of like racist remarks to it. So so it's like accepting a gift from somebody who's like racist almost.
Yeah.
So I had to like be at peace with that.
Mm-hmm.
And do something about it. It was more of like just something that I felt like I had to deal with,
Mm-hmm.
but then in my own way. So I was like, yes, this is from the Philippines, made by a Filipino person, but then it was acquired by somebody.
Yeah.
So I just had to come at peace that she gave them back to me almost.
I see.
It's almost like reparations, I guess. So it was like a peace offering
Yeah.
by my old boss.
I see. So do you think like the history of it informs the art piece?
Not so much anymore because I like came at peace with it. So now I'm just using it for more of like my message and my aesthetic rather than like having all that heaviness to of the material, including because I feel like I don't want to put out anything negative out there. So
so how much like of your own Filipino identity informs your art?
a lot of it, because I was reading this interview by another artist who's Filipino, and he said that, I forgot his name, but he was saying like, if you make work and you're Filipino, then you're making Filipino art. Because a lot of people might think that, oh hey, he's not painting farmlands or water buffaloes or huts or something like that, then it's not Filipino art. Which I kind of understand, and which is why like one of the goals in my work is to like, hey, there are Filipino artists who make contemporary work who kind of are aware of contemporary art history and all that. Yeah, so I would say also because I talk about identity a lot and like my journey as an immigrant, a Filipino immigrant
Mhm.
here in the U.S. So yeah.
So how do you like incorporate your Filipino identity into your art? Like how does it inform your art? Like, yeah.
Um, like for the simplest
Mhm.
explanations, I guess I use a lot of like raw materials, which most especially raw canvas, and I always kind of like compare that color to like my skin color,
Mhm.
brown.
Mm-hmm.
So in that, that talks about kind of like my identity, and there were times where I would paint over it with like a black or a wash of white, and most recently like blue.
Mhm.
Um, so I wanted to talk about like colonialism, colorism, and then the fact that for us Asians, being an immigrant, it's not like a physical wall or mountains that we have to cross. We actually have to cross like the ocean
Mhm.
and the sky. That's the reason why I started using blue in my work. And then I always start off a piece by drawing a grid on the surface, and with that, I'm talking about topography,
Mhm.
geography, location, and also what is it called? The science of making maps. Cartography.
Yeah.
There you go.
Mhm.
So yeah. But yeah, and then using materials that are, like the pineapple fiber and all that. Yeah. So with materials, I get to talk about my identity.
I see.
Yeah.
When had you always known about like the history of like colonialism in the Philippines and trying to push that message, or did you have to like learn about that, actively learn about that, all of that?
When I was in the Philippines, I really didn't care at all
Mm-hmm.
about the
Mhm.
history. I just know, well, we were raised thinking that the U.S. were, the heroes.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then later on, I'm learning that there was a Philippine-American War
Mm-hmm.
that happened where, they had to slaughter a lot of Filipinos, and that we were used to help fight against Spanish because, we were like conditioned to think that, hey, we're the good guys.
Mhm.
But then at the same time, because the whole Philippine-American War
Mm-hmm.
was erased from history, like they didn't teach that
Absolutely.
growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And then also having like a colonial mentality,
Mhm.
thinking, like anything from the U.S. is like the best thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, it wasn't until here that I got more interested into the history, to a point where I'm learning more about the Philippines before it was even colonized by Spain.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of pre-colonial history, pre-colonial knowledges, religion,
Mm-hmm.
Even the text, alphabet, and all that.
Chelsea, did you have?
I think earlier you mentioned you met your wife in art school.
Yeah.
Does she still do art as well?
She does art
Mhm.
here and there. Mostly like a lot of craft work. She sews.
Mhm.
But yeah, we met in art school. We were classmates. but then we never talked during that class. Yeah, it wasn't after. It was after that class, because I was showing, and so I kept inviting her to my art shows, and she never went until that one time that she came, and then we started talking and eventually dating and then getting married.
Do you think that she ever influences your work?
Yeah, she does. Because she's also an immigrant herself. She's from Mexico, so it talks like we're always kind of like comparing and contrasting Filipino and Mexican culture at the same time. And then, the whole history about the Acapulco, Manila galleon trade as well that happened. Like, there's like Filipino tamales that I don't even know about. And then there's like Mexican adobo, which is like completely different from like ours. Yeah, and then like the things that we talk about all the time, border, immigration, racism and all that, racial inequalities. So yeah, her, being married to me, being around me, yeah, she contributes a lot into my practice as well. Well, I mean, also she helps me sometimes because she sews.
Yeah.
I don't want to touch her sewing machine. If I have to sew something, I sew it by hand. But yeah, there was one time I was doing a large painting that was going to be for the Dallas Contemporary Art Fair. So she was helping me like make my canvas boxes. So she was sewing those. So yeah, so she helps me when she can.
Does religion inform your art in any sense, or like ideology, like Taoism, for example, or something like that?
No, not really.
No?
Not really. Why do you ask?
Oh, because you just mentioned the Dallas Contemporary Art Fair.
Oh,
Oh,
Dallas.
Dallas.
Oh,
I meant Dallas.
Dallas. I heard
Oh.
Dallas.
Sorry.
I was like, interesting.
Yeah, Dallas. Yeah. Well, in terms, I was born and raised. Oh, I was raised Catholic.
Oh, right.
So, no, I don't really include that because to me, because my wife is Catholic as well, and we practice, and it's just something that we keep to ourselves. Like we don't knock on people's doors and like, hey, come with us, kind of thing.
Do you feel like your race has like affected your career in any sense, like your success in your career, or?
I feel like it could be. And it's one of the reasons why like I'm trying to push Filipino work further out, because like when people think of Asian art, they always think of like East Asian art, Chinese, Korean, Japanese art are like well represented in the art world. And recently I attended like a brown artist retreat. And so because we think like South Asians and Southeast Asians, we claim to be brown. So I went there and it was full, it's mostly Hispanic and Latino artists. So I was saying like, hey, we're brown too. So where are we what part of the conversation are we in? So it was just me and another artist who was Thai. So we had like all the discussion about how we're also kind of like underrepresented in terms of like not even just art alone, but you know, in a lot of things. Because like when people think Asian, they always either think, oh, it's always almost Chinese. Um, so I feel like in the brown community, we're underrepresented, and then in the Asian community, we're underrepresented as well. So yeah, it plays, me being Filipino plays a huge role, I believe, because especially like for curators maybe, or museum directors, when they automatically think like, hey, we need Asian art, then they wouldn't automatically think like, hey, Filipinos are part of that, you know. Yeah, so like in the Houston community, I'm really pushing hard for that to happen. Like I'm like in conversation with Asia Society of Texas, which was like surprising. They have like a Filipino art show right now, but then it's not like Filipinos in Houston. So that's the conversation that I wanted to bring in. And then, you know, like even in just art communities as well, like especially like with that Brown Artist Retreat, there was like a lot of other artists who were interested into, you know, collaborating and listening to, you know, to what I have to say. So I think it can happen eventually.
How connected are you with the Filipino community in Houston?
It's hard to say, because most Filipinos are very regionalistic, so it depends on where you're from. Then that's like part of the group that you hang out with. But I would say, like, I'm not best friends with them, but then I can work with them. There's, you know, like one of the Filipino communities here, they're called Filipino Young Professionals. My sister-in-law is like the president of that organization. And then there's another one called Unipro, which is a nationwide Filipino organization. Like I'm really good friends with like the president and the other officers involved in that. Among the Filipino artists, there's really not a lot, and there's really like not a solid group of people that, like I could say like the person that I showed with here at Rice, you know, Isabel, she's the one that I've been showing with for the most part, who's also Filipino. But yeah, well, that's the goal, is to like gather all of them, and you know, start doing things together rather than just separately and being underrepresented. And so yeah, just lifting each other up as a community.
So you're trying to like get it off the ground, like the Filipino artist community here?
Yeah, because it already exists. There's professors, there's, you know, there's Filipinos in the creative community who's already in positions that could kind of like help us. It's just a matter of like getting everybody together and doing something. Because like comparing, I talk with like other Filipino artists, like in the East Coast and West Coast, comparing their communities to like Houston community, we're like not even there. Yeah, we're like baby compared to something like I get jealous of communities in San Francisco in particular because they have like everybody, like they have curators, they have, you know, museum directors, they have gallery owners who are Filipino, and you know, that's something that we barely have here.
So how do you see like that type of community being able to form in the future? Like you working actively towards something like that.
Well, like what are the steps that I'm taking?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like my goal for this year is to have an art show. Because I feel like people need to see something first. And then from there, kind of like start building the community from inside. You know, like maybe there's like an artist who's struggling and, you know, but makes work. Then maybe there's something that we can do to, you know, help him or her in some way. And then maybe like start talking to like younger Filipino kids who wants to do something creative, but then are pressured, you know, to do something that they don't want to do.
Yeah.
Yeah, just, you know, like representation and how important that is. I think that if they see that there are Filipino artists out there and not just, you know, Asian artists in general, then they'd be more confident in pursuing something that they really want. And then, you know, after that, hopefully, you know, a community emerges where it's more solidified rather than separated like how it is right now.
Have there ever been periods where you felt insecure about your art or your abilities?
Yeah, all the time. Because I make work as a living, so I'm alone a lot. It's always like a battle in my head, like, hey, you can do this, or why is this happening to me, kind of thing. Or like, why wasn't I picked, you know? Because like for an artist, it's kind of hard to just wait to be like, hey, like pick me for this show or whatnot, but you have to apply to make shows or to get involved in institutions and have a show, like, you know, just like the one that we had. My friend Isabel and I applied to be shown here at Rice, and we got accepted for that. But when I get rejected, I always like, why? You know? But then I know that it's not really about the art, but it's, you know, knowing institutions and knowing how like donors work and all that, that also comes to play. So that kind of like makes me just like brush it off and be like, okay, well, let me just make more work. You know, I can't have something like that slow me down if I get rejected, and it's just going to be like one thing on top of that list or that pile of rejection letters. And yeah, because you can see it like that the system is broken and they don't want certain conversations involved in their institutions. So yeah, they're scared.
So how do you like confront that struggle, you know, with like the institution having like having gatekeepers and you trying to get into those gates?
It's hard. I mean, it's a question that I constantly ask myself because like let's say like I type up a proposal for for a certain institution, I always ask my wife, like, hey, can you read this? Is this too white? Or is it white enough for them to understand? So in a way, it's hard, and it's I hate it that I have to kind of like whitewash
I see.
my message.
I see.
But then at the same time, if they get it, then that's going to be like a step in. So once I get my step in, then I can like start pulling like other people in, you know what I mean? But then at the same time, I'm very conflicted about the whole idea of like, hey, yeah, you're in a respectable institution as a Filipino artist, but then I'm scared of thinking like this is like the white audience. And I hate feeling being exotified or tokenized.
I see.
So that's like a constant question that I have, and I haven't really
Answered.
I don't have any answers to that yet, like how I have to deal with that, but it's just something I have to deal with. And I even asked this question like at that artist retreat that I attended recently, and even them, they don't know. But then most of their answers was just like, we just need to get our foot in, so we can start disrupting the system. And I was like, I agree, but I guess you just have to deal with the whole whitewashing thing.
Yeah.
You know, and you just have to deal with being tokenist for a little bit. You know, kind of like doing it for the culture, or doing it for the rest of doing it for the next generation almost kind of thing.
So have you been to like showings outside of like have you showed your art outside of Houston before? Like
Yeah.
And what other areas have you gotten involved in?
I've showed in LA. I've showed in like San Francisco. I've shown in Oklahoma, Arizona, Dallas. I've shown there a lot. I've shown in San Antonio, DC. I'm going to be part of a show in Miami for the first time this year. Yeah.
How do like each of the areas like kind of like compare to each other?
Well, like the West Coast is, because their community is bigger there and more solidified, it's like, it's just easy, you almost don't have like to do anything really, or have to worry about anything, because it doesn't matter like what kind of message you put out there, it's sort of accepted, or it's a discussion that already
It's accessible.
Yeah. But like, I felt like in DC it was kind of, I mean even in Dallas, not in Oak Cliff, but like Deep Ellum.
Oh, Deep Ellum.
Yeah, like that. There's a gallery there that I had to show with, but because it's like an upscale gallery, so like the audience was mostly white, and I had to kind of put extra effort into having to explain a lot of things.
Yeah.
So I think that's where I had to struggle the most, which is kind of weird. But yeah, it's mostly like with white audience, or mostly white audience.
So like, what keeps you in Houston? Like, why the Houston art scene instead of going to like San Francisco where it's open and accessible?
Well, Houston, mainly because my family's here.
Oh yeah.
There's where we immigrated to, and then you know, my wife works here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, there's something about Houston that's, it's like a big city, but a small city.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like, well, now, I feel like I have a mission to kind of like cultivate something here. You know, I don't want to just go
Go somewhere
into a
else.
city where it's already said, then you have to be part of that.
Mhm.
I feel like that would be just too easy.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I like Houston. I don't like the cold that much. I like the food here
Mhm.
for the most part. You know, traveling, it's always disappointing having to travel and kind of, you know, just eat whatever. um, yeah, it's mostly family.
Nice.
Also, the cost of living is low,
Mhm.
and there's money here. You know, like the oil and gas industry's here, biggest medical centers here.
Mhm.
So in a way, kind of works out.
I have a question for guys though.
So what do you think have been some of your favorite pieces or exhibits that you've enjoyed doing the most?
It's hard to say. I really enjoyed showing at the Pennzoil building in downtown because of, like, you know, the history of the building. It was like, it's like a designer building almost, by Philip Johnson. And then I just had like this whole space for myself in the lobby. And you know, it was intimate. There was like a lot of people that saw the show, and they didn't have to, they could just like see it, and they didn't have to kind of like I guess it was more accessible to the public rather than having to like go inside a museum or a gallery or something like that, which is kind of intimidating to a lot of audience. I mean, I enjoyed my show here at Rice. It was cold, but there was like a lot of interesting people that came, and that's how I met you guys. There was a show in LA that I was part of. It wasn't just Filipino artists, but we were in the mix. But it was POC artists, and just the quality of the work, you know, from performance art to video art to photography, painting, sculpture. I thought it was like a really good curated show. You know, yeah.
As an artist, like, who do you draw like a lot of inspiration from?
I used to say, like Cy Twombly, Robert Rauschenberg, you know, all these white artists, like de Kooning and all that. It's like, yeah, like art history, you know. But eventually, I got really bored with them, and I started looking more into, you know, artists of color. So one of the artists that I take inspiration from is Leonardo Drew,
Mm.
who's a black artist, and then Mark Bradford,
Mhm.
Ruth Asawa, who's Asian, and she does sculpture. And then also looking into not only art, but also, you know, like authors and poets and all
Mhm.
that. And then, yeah, just taking inspiration from all that.
Have you gone back to the Philippines since you immigrated here?
No.
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 Do you have family there?
Yeah, I do. You know, extended family,
Mm.
but we still have our house there.
Mhm.
And it's always like a big debate with my parents, like whether to sell it or not.
Mhm.
We have plans, like, you know, my family and I. It's just
Mhm.
costs a lot of money. And the travel time is like
Mhm.
16-hour flights and all that.
Mhm.
So in a way, if you're really, you know, like I don't know if it's really going to be a vacation just because
Mhm.
the travel alone is already exhausting.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Plus my kids, you know, like I have a son who only turned 5, and I feel like he probably wouldn't enjoy it as much yet.
Mhm.
So I want everybody to enjoy it when we get back.
Mhm.
But my wife has been wanting to go.
Mhm.
Or maybe even live there,
Mhm.
which I'm completely open to.
Mhm.
How much of like the Filipino culture do you try to pass on to your son?
Um, well, I also have a daughter.
Oh,
who's
and
14.
your kids, your
Yeah.
kids. I'm sorry.
I try to.
Mhm.
My wife always like tells me to like talk to them in Filipino or Tagalog,
Mhm.
but it's hard for me because like my family, they talk to me in English
Mm.
because we grew up speaking English first,
Mhm.
Mhm.
and um, you know, and then my wife is fluent in Spanish and English. So if I say something in Filipino, then she wouldn't understand it. So
Mhm.
it's like, but yeah, I try. You know, I tell them words, and I tell
Mhm.
them like, hey, this is how you say it. This is how to pronounce it. This is how you spell it. But then I also expose them to like the food,
Mhm.
which they get a lot from my parents. You know,
Mhm.
hanging out with my parents or at their house because, you know, even their cousins, my older brother's wife is Filipino as well.
Mhm.
But then my younger brother's wife is Vietnamese, and then my sister's fiance is like Mexican, but he was raised as white. Um, so it's like the whole UN of my parents. Whenever, you know, we
Sounds
get,
like a fun time.
yeah, you know, we get to share like a lot of food and
Mhm.
different kinds. But yeah, it's the same thing with my wife. Like, some she talks to them in Spanish sometimes, but then I think we all get together or we all agree like when it comes to food. So like food has always been kind of like a gateway to introduce like different
Mhm.
things to them as kids. You know, and like I drop off my daughter to school every morning, and there are times where I would just listen to Filipino music or
Mhm.
bands and whatnot. I mean, I don't know if she cares, but but it's there, you know.
Mhm.
I'm sure she'll remember those things. I'm sure
Mhm.
she'll recognize those things.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, having Filipino things at home.
Mhm.
Oh, well, we also celebrate like all the traditions, but then we also celebrate Mexican traditions at home. So it's like the best of both worlds.
Chelsea, did you have-
Do you have any goals for your work in the future? Any new ideas or?
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's always like new ideas.
Mhm.
I'm slowly getting into more sculptural work,
Mhm.
like more something. Well, I mean, my work has always been sculptural, but then they've always like hung on the wall.
Yeah. Mhm.
So now I'm getting into more something, things that are objects that either like belong on the floor or like lean on the wall or hang from the ceiling or something like that. So just broadening my whole practice. My goal has always been to be shown at the museum, and I mean eventually I'll get there, I'm sure. But yeah, that's always just been my goal.
Do you think that you'll continue to have a really strong sense of your Filipino identity in your work?
I think so. Probably even more so like in the future, than today. Because I'm surrounding myself with like Filipino literature as well. And I'm not just talking about like dead poets or whatever, or authors or whatever, but they're still working and writing and making work. So I'm always gonna be influenced, and then knowledge about the history is just gonna keep growing for me. So yeah, so maybe like in 20 years it'd probably be more Filipino than ever. Yeah, because I mean that's one of the reasons why I chose to be an artist, is because I could be like on a wheelchair at 90 and still be making work, compared to like 65 and overly tired and stressed out. One of the reasons why.
Do you do anything else on the side besides working on your art? Like, yeah.
Well, I would say that it's my day job, but like I make paintings for designers sometimes. So that's how I get some of my income. Like I do commission work and all that. And then other things like install, because they need people to do install for them sometimes, and I do that. I take photographs of Asian grocery stores on the side, like a hobby, because I think it's an interesting space to be in. There's almost kind of like a home feel to it. It's a different feeling I get, like, going to Whole Foods or H-E-B or Kroger. It's completely different. And food is always like a thing. And a lot of identities can be identified or explained by food alone. So, like, I don't know. It's just some side project that I do. Yeah, I mean, I've gotten a lot of good response from it. Just because, like, people have different reasons on why they're really, like, I don't know, I just get random messages saying, like, hey, I really like what you're doing. So, okay, I'll just keep going. Yeah. I mean, it talks a lot about the immigrant story and how the first Chinese immigrants were the first ones to start restaurants here in the U.S. So that as well.
Do you have any like goals for the future in general, as an like an artist or as a person or anything?
I mean, like what I mentioned earlier,
Mm-hmm.
the goal has always been, you know, to be kind of like side by side with like the big white artists that like, you know, like, oh, who's your favorite artist? Picasso? I want to change that story, you know, like I want to change it to where, like, hey, you have a Manalo or something like that, or, because like, I feel like I have a purpose
Mm-hmm.
immigrating here. Like it wasn't really clear to me at first, but then now it's become, you know, clearer to me as like what I should be doing, and yeah, I just really want to change that whole narrative of the whole like who should be the artist, or who's like who's capable of being an artist in America. You know, I mean, it has always been the white male, and it's still the same way even after, you know, so many years. Like the artists that are still being talked about right now are dead, and they were making work like in the 70s or something like that, and it's still the same way, and that has changed. So like while I'm doing that as well, I think that it's important to also uplift other communities, like, you know, the Black communities and the Latino communities, because like whatever step forward that they make will be good for us, for everybody. So yeah, that's the goal.
Are you connected with any sense like the contemporary artist community in the Philippines?
I have an uncle who's like a well-known artist there, but I'm not really like personally close to him.
I see.
In a way, I kind of don't want to, because I want to make a name for myself. But it's like an audience that I'm trying to build as well. Eventually, like, you know, people have started collecting my work there, but I haven't really shown there yet. So yeah, eventually I'll get to some point, you know, without having, you know, to use like my family card to get that. You know, and then I have my cousins who said the same thing, and who are willing to like help, you know, to make that possible.
Do you feel like the art of the contemporary Filipino community in the Philippines themselves is very much different from the Filipino American community in America?
Yeah, it is. Because like it only really started booming like maybe 5 to 6 years ago, and I was like closely following it. A lot of Filipino art a lot of them still talk about just like, you know, what is beautiful or something aesthetic based. But I feel like Filipino American art has been more political. I know a lot of folks who, you know, do a lot of portraiture because, you know, they want to talk about identity here, like what it is to be a Filipino immigrant here. But if you're a Filipino artist in the Philippines, then you get to, I guess that's like the least of your problems, so that's like something that you don't really talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I feel like it's completely different. Although there's like some artists who travel back and
Mhm.
forth, and I see their work and they do both,
Mhm.
which is okay. I mean, there's
Mhm.
nothing wrong with whatever subject matter they choose,
Mhm.
but I can tell that it's different.
I guess in terms of like, cause you push a lot of like political messages through your like identity and your art. Are you involved with like any type of like activism in like, cause there's a lot of intersections between art and activism. So like, do you interact with like any modes of activism here at in Houston or?
Um, yeah, but you know, I do it like in a personal way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I do things like, because I do support like Black Lives Matter,
Mhm.
um, organizations like who are for, you know, immigration and all
Mhm.
that. But I feel like there's also a lot of things that we need to learn for ourselves, that we have to do to take part of, you know, in that activism and to take part in that process of healing of communities and all that.
Mhm.
So I'm doing a lot of like that in personal manner, where I'm learning so
Mhm.
that I could speak and stand up better for other
Mhm.
people. Um, but also because I have kids, so I'm
Mhm.
kind of like pushing back a little bit.
I see.
Because I know I don't want to get, you know,
Yeah.
somebody can easily just pull out a gun at a protest, and,
Mhm.
you know, I don't want my kids to be fatherless
Yeah.
either. So in a way, I'm being careful about that.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, I try to make it known
Mhm.
to like people that this is what I stand for.
Mhm.
Um, you know, like, because I have family members, I have friends who are like Trump supporters and all that,
Mhm.
and they think that what he's doing is like the best for the country, and I'm like, yeah, but know that this is what I think about it, you know.
Mhm.
Know that this is what I stand for. So yeah, like talking to people, you know, like my friends and family about those things. That's how I'm, you know, doing my activism.
Mhm.
Like I don't really want to be like a troll or something like that online or
Mhm.
anything, because I feel like it's a waste of time. I
Yeah.
feel like you can, the best way to like convince someone or to change their hearts is to talk to them as a friend.
Mhm.
But then if they retaliate like in an aggressive manner, then that's completely different, you know?
Yeah.
That's where it gets scary for me.
Mhm.
And it's something I'm not ready for
Mhm.
at the moment.
I see. Well, Chelsea, did you have any other questions?
No, no. Unless you have anything else you want to
Mhm.
talk about.
Um, well, I guess like talking about more about activism, like I support communities of color, like especially like in the art, like
Mhm.
I support Project Row Houses a lot,
Oh, yeah.
and what they stand for and what they do. You know, in the community that they're trying to build, like there's the Shape Center that's part of the Third Ward. But yeah, like I even have like a friend who's like a food blogger, but he only talks about, or he only features like black-owned businesses and restaurants and stuff like that. And yeah, like I completely support his cause, and I have a friend who owns a restaurant. And he's getting like huge, like in the whole food community scene, at a national scale. And it's funny because I met him, and it was just like an assistant chef back
Mhm.
then, and now he has his own restaurant. Yeah, I mean, it was like a Filipino member in the Black Panther community, you know.
Mm.
So, you know, I feel like being a person, we have like that responsibility towards each other, and on a bigger scale, not just to ourselves, but to like a community, helping build that, you know, so that everybody can live in a better place, and not just like, you know, like the Asian community is better than, you know, comparing ourselves is not gonna change things. But if we work together as one, and we're here to like fight one problem, which is white supremacy, then I think everybody can can take advantage of that or benefit from it. So yeah.
Yep. Well, I think we don't really have any more questions. So, all right. Well, thank you for your time and
Yeah.
allowing us to interview you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. To eat.